Good morning. Mark Armitage coming to you from my Dinosaur Soft Tissue Research Institute laboratory. It's not a brick and mortar building as much as I would love for it to be, but it's a humble laboratory, and I might add it's the only creationist laboratory in the world dedicated to studying dinosaur soft tissue remains with the capabilities, the equipment, and the know-how to do it. And so what you see coming out of my laboratory is original basic research on soft dinosaur tissues, an amazing phenomenon that needs to be told to the whole world. Sadly, I don't receive a great deal of funding for this laboratory. Much of the donations that come in are $5, $10. Occasionally someone will donate a wonderful donation of $1,000, $2,000, or $3,000, and for that I'm extremely and eternally grateful. But to maintain and run a laboratory of this caliber, a world-class laboratory, costs real money, and unless something dramatic happens in terms of an ongoing, consistent, large amount of money that can support this laboratory will not continue forever. It's not possible. And so I'm trying to show how it's done. I'm trying to prove that it can be done in hopes that when I do retire and close down this laboratory, those of you who come behind can pick up this mantle and move forward with it. Now, as scientists, especially those of us in the creation community who call ourselves scientists, we must hold ourselves to the same high standard of science, of integrity, of inquiry, and hard work that is characteristic of the scientific community at large. I'm reminded of an article published by Dr. Richard Lumsden back in 1992 entitled "Error and Worse in the Scientific Literature," and this, of course, by the late great Richard Lumsden, who was my major professor, who trained me in parasitology and in electron microscopy, who gave me the kind of world-class training that has allowed me to publish over 30 articles in secular peer-reviewed journals. And I'm proud of that, not just because I've been able to do the work and that the scientific community recognizes my basic research as something that can and should be published, but I'm pretty sure it's kind of a record in the creation movement. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'll let historians discuss that once I have retired. But in this article, Dr. Lumsden, who I might add was Dean of the Graduate School at Tulane University, has some very interesting things to say about the quality and character of creationist work and how it stands up to the kind of work that he did. He minted 6 PhDs. What does that mean? He trained and launched 6 PhDs who are now very active in the world of science and publishing regularly in Journal of Parasitology and other journals. This is a man who handled millions and millions of dollars in grant money from the National Institutes of Health, from NSF, and other granting institutions. And so this is a guy who knows what he's talking about. And when you read what he says here, prior to my present academic affiliation, I served as a grant-funded, grant-dependent, and therefore grant-seeking professor and administrator at a major secular university for more than 20 years. That was Tulane University, folks. And as I say, he did fabulous work. He's a world-class parasitologist and electron microscopist. And I'm sure that it hasn't been even a couple of years ago, and maybe even recently, that his papers from the 60s and 70s are still being referenced in the referenced literature. He says at such institutions, research productivity, measured chiefly by the number of papers published, per unit time, and to a degree the dollar amounts of funds acquired to support it has become the major criterion for tenure and promotion in science faculty. In other words, it's a hallmark of a scientist to acquire funding, to use that funding to perform research, and to publish peer-reviewed world-class science in the journals. Now, he talks about how quality and quantity are not mutually exclusive, but reviewed publication and grant support are taken as evidence of peer recognition of quality scholarship. And so if we as creationists are going to be taken by the scientific secular community as having evidence of scholarship, we must publish, we must do basic research, and we must get it published in the peer-reviewed scientific community. And I would dare say that that is something that we are sorely in need of. He goes on in this paper, he's quoting several professors who are lamenting that they're forced to do research in order to make a living and not be humiliated and terminated by their institutions. But he goes on to say that a salaried university professor, tangible scholarship is not an avocation nor an elective activity. In other words, it's not something you dream about. It's not something you do as an elective. It is part of your job. He says research has always been a part of the job description at the university level, and the qualifications of the professor submitted for consideration in the first place. In other words, if you are going to profess in science, you must have a current, regular, consistent program of research and publication in the peer-reviewed journal. Now let's compare that to the creationist community and ask ourselves, is that something we are doing? He's going to answer that question in a minute. But that's the hallmark. That's the those are the qualifications for a PhD who is professing in science, and Lord knows we have a lot of those, don't we, in the creationist community. And so he does say, after all, the PhD is a research degree, not simply a teaching certificate. And so, folks, if a person claims or shows that they have a PhD, it's because they did research at the university where they acquired their PhD, and they published that research in a peer-reviewed journal, and so they know how to do it. They know how to do it. But they've abandoned that program of standard PhD scholarship if they're not doing that anymore. And Lord knows we got a lot of those in creation science. And that's something that I think the scientific community looks at and maybe ridicules and mocks because they're doing it daily. They're digging into science. Oh, and we could say, well, they won't publish our work. They won't. Look, folks, I've shown how it's done. Now, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here. I'm setting a standard for the creationist community for others to follow. And I'm not going to continue this forever. I don't have the energy, and I certainly don't have the money, unless somebody steps up with $50 million to keep this thing going. Because that's what it's going to take. But in any event, if you're a PhD and you're professing and you're teaching about science, I don't care if you're a creationist, an evolutionist, or a druid, you should have as your standard practice basic research in a laboratory with new findings that are presented for publications to be published, that are peer-reviewed and finally published or presented at scientific meetings. That is the standard, period. And so Dr. Lumsden discusses this. He says the expectation that the employee would do his job is hardly outrageous. I love the way he writes. Sometimes it's at a level that you have to deconstruct and understand a little bit, but he's saying it's not outrageous for PhDs to do what they're paid to do. That's what he's saying. And so the university or the institution will provide the facilities and wherewithal to do the research, But it's up to the faculty, the teachers, the professors who have the PhD and who profess in science to do the work. We're not doing it. We're not doing it. We're not doing it. And it's a big problem, and it's one that's causing the evolutionary community, and therefore the whole secular community, to laugh at us. Why do they mock us in so many ways and say, well, you don't do research, you don't publish research, therefore you're not a scientist, you're a Bible thumper? Well, they have a point. They have a point. And so I haven't done anything special here. I've just done what's expected of a PhD. And so the standard is have a laboratory, do the work, present new findings, get it published in peer-reviewed journals, and continue that practice. Don't just rest on something you wrote 50 years ago. So this is what Dr. Lumsden is setting as a standard. Now he goes on and he talks about the way the evolutionary community handles creationists. He says, for example, when there's a debate, an evolutionist will not uncommonly, which means he commonly resorts to attacks about his scientific credentials. Well, your PhD was at Liberty University, or, not Harvard, or, Cornell. And we have some PhDs in our group from Cornell. And so there are ad hominem attacks, he says, about creationists' scientific credentials. And creationist journals. And so we do have our own journals, and they are different from the journals that secular science, regular science, standard science is published in. There's a level of quality, there's a level of basic research that's presented in the standard journals that are not presented in the creationist journals. And so he says that the creation scientists have been characterized by the establishment, by evolutionists, as talking or writing about science while doing very little of it themselves. And so he's using the evolutionary group, the establishment group, as an example of people who are saying these things about creationists, and he's not disagreeing with them. He's right. Most of the papers that are published in the creationist journals are based on work done by others and not work done by themselves. In fact, he says, in any case, it is not uncommon to find creationist papers structured entirely of data elsewhere acquired. Again, I love the way he writes, but he's saying creationist papers are full of data that are acquired from other work. They're not original, basic research. And then he makes a very important point. He says, at that point, there may be some substance to the view that one who has no direct experience himself with the techniques, the study object system, the raw data acquisition, and subsequent analysis is not in the best position to evaluate these data or draw conclusions from them. He's being very kind. What he is saying is that if you have no direct experience with the techniques that are used to acquire the data, if you have no direct experience with the study of the object or system that's being looked at, if you have no direct experience with the raw data acquisition, and you have no direct experience with the analysis, then you're not in any position to evaluate the data or to draw conclusions from them. And I have to say I agree with him. And so much of what is done, and I'm going to get off this hobby horse that I'm on. So much of what is done in the creation world is a rehashing of the work of others. We continue with Dr. Lumsden's article. He's now spent some time in his article discussing error and worse in the scientific literature and the reasons that some of these errors show up in our publications. And he talks about retractions of erroneous or misleading findings by the journals themselves, how they retract things or take them back in later editions of the journal. However, he does continue and make an important point here about the behavior of some authors when it comes to retractions of work that's been published in the open scientific literature. He says one or more co-authors may withdraw from a paper subsequent to its publication, and he makes a citation there. And he says they disavow and thereby call attention to an egregious error or worse committed by a recalcitrant cohort. In other words, there are authors who find that they have to separate themselves from scientific publications or publications in the scientific arena about the work that they may have been involved in that they regard as erroneous. And so they withdraw. They separate themselves from the work and the authors who have produced that work. And he goes on to discuss how this happens in secular science and in secular publishing. And we get very little of that in the creationist world. But sadly, I find myself in a position now, based on the work that I've done on the Triceratops horn, that I collected in Montana with the help of others, that I brought to my laboratory, not a university laboratory, but to my laboratory, which I've maintained for some 12 years now, in light and electron microscopy. And a horn specimen that I studied myself using my own equipment and doing the basic research, got new findings from, and then of course put those findings into a paper and published it. Now I did name another author as a co-author on the paper as a professional courtesy. And I think that is important for several reasons. But nevertheless, we're not talking here about work that I was not associated with. We're talking about work that I was directly associated with. And so I find myself in the unenviable position now of having to withdraw, retract myself from some things that have been published about this work. And I have two examples today of why this is needed. The first one is an article published online entitled 6 Fossil Timers Stun Secular Scientists by Brian Thomas. Okay, catchy title, but he discusses my work, the Triceratops horn work. He makes some pretty big errors which are sad because a simple reading of the paper and studying of the paper would have corrected this situation. Number one. Number two, the errors that are made downplay the incredible significance of the discovery that was made. And so there's an improper understanding of the significance of the discoveries that I made in my laboratory. And as these other scientists discuss it, they're making major egregious errors that downplay that significance. And so that's one. The second one is this book entitled Echoes of the Jurassic by Kevin Anderson. And once again, there are some major errors made in this book that could be corrected by a simple reading and studying of the paper to which Dr. Anderson was added as a professional courtesy as a co-author. In this publication by Brian Thomas, he states, researchers used weak acid to remove bone mineral and expose a hand-sized sheet of flexible osteoid tissue inside a Triceratops horn. So what is he saying? He's saying that in order to expose these hand-sized sheets of flexible bone tissue, what we call the stretchy fibrillar bone, in the paper, it could only have been gotten out by soaking it in a weak acid. Now, again, in the paper, where we talk about these soft sheets of fibrillar bone, I state clearly 3 times in the paper that these soft, stretchy sheets were recovered from undecalcified bone. In other words, bone that did not have to be soaked in a weak acid. Here is one paragraph that discusses this. Pieces of small fixed material from the inner core of the horn came apart with moderate hand pressure. In other words, just by putting pressure on them with my hands, I was able to break the inner horn core pieces open, apart. And they were found to contain thin, elastic, reddish-brown flaps of soft material, figure 5, white arrow, which we'll look at in a second. But in this paragraph, we're talking about what happened with the bone, what took place with the bone in processing after jacketing and removal from the ground. And I discussed that, and I discussed the fixation of the horn. In other words, putting the horn pieces into a fixative in order to stabilize them. I'm not talking about using a weak acid here. I'm talking about using fixative. And so it clearly says that these pieces of small fixed material, not decalcified, but fixed material from the inner horn core were found to contain these thin, elastic, reddish-brown flaps of soft, stretchy material. So there's the first place where I mentioned this. The second place is in a paragraph just above that, where it says, large strips of thin, light brown, soft material were recovered from the innermost interior sections of other fixed and unfixed, non-decalcified horn bone pieces. In other words, here I clearly state that we're talking about bone pieces that were either put in the fixative and stabilized, fixed, or not put in the fixative and therefore unfixed, but clearly non-decalcified. This is no soaking in acid, and yet these large strips of thin, light brown, soft material were found without decalcification. The third place that I mentioned this is in the caption for Figure 5. And the caption for Figure 5 states that here we have a light micrograph, a flap of fixed soft tissue with a white arrow pointing to it, slightly peeled away from undecalcified Triceratops bone specimen, black arrow, and I mentioned other factors regarding to the figure. So here now in Figure 5, I'm clearly showing a piece of a flap of this pulled away, soft, stretchy material from an undecalcified piece of horn. And so it's sad, really. It's sad that we don't do more careful work by reading the work of others when we go to comment on it. And so I have to withdraw from papers like this that do not explain exactly what was published in my paper because, and here's the reason why, this discounts the huge implications of what I found. All, if not most, of the other dinosaur finds of soft tissue were found in long bones, in things like femurs and such. And so these are highly encapsulated areas of soft tissue at the very center of the bone, surrounded by massive amounts of bone mineral. Okay? And that's what we were looking for when we went to Montana, but we didn't find that. We found a 48-inch long horn that was ripped away from the skull of a Triceratops head and jammed into the ground point down. And so you have the large end of the horn where it was ripped away from the skull, and all those vascular bundles, and here you see a cross-section of the horn, and you see all those vascular bundles at the center, all wide open to the environment, and so mud and water and insects and microbes and bacteria and plant roots and fungal bodies and everything went down in there, and we're having a heyday with all of the soft tissue inside of this upended, ripped away, completely exposed horn. And yet, I found in sections of the interior part of the horn, which was completely fractured, by the way. Okay, this was not intact. It was not highly encapsulated like these femurs that they found are. This was the opposite. And so you had all these environmental factors, water, snow, ice, thermal fluctuation, who knows what radioactivity is in the ground, all of this stuff tearing away at the soft tissue in this horn for 68 million years, and yet just by opening it up and not even decalcifying it, I'm finding soft, stretchy flaps of fibrillar bone. Do you understand the significance now of this find? This shows that, and as I have predicted before, that soft tissue in the fossil record is the norm and not the exception. We're talking about tissues that should have been completely gobbled up, eaten away, torn apart, broken down in maybe 500 to 1,000 years. Certainly 4,000 years since the flood, and yet they're still there. This is huge, folks. This discovery of the soft tissue that I found in this Triceratops horn is huge. And so we need to understand that. And if we're going to read each other's work and comment on it, let's get it right. Now, I have to tell you, what's even more sad about this is that I offered my personal expert advice on this discovery and my publication through direct communication to Mr. Thomas and ICR, and was ignored. And so it's unfortunate that I must now disavow myself of this work and others like it, where my work is mischaracterized by creationists who don't understand the work. It's really unfortunate, and especially when I offer my direct assistance and it's ignored. And so I have to be true to the science. I have to be true to the scientific community, because they're watching, my friends. They are watching what the creationists are saying about my work, because they're aware of my work. They were so aware of my work that they threw me out of Cal State University Northridge. And you've heard about the big lawsuit, and you heard about the fact that I won the lawsuit. So they're very aware of me, my laboratory, my work, and my publications. And when they see gross errors like this among supposed compatriots, it casts a shadow over me and my work. And so I have to disavow myself of works like this and others that mischaracterize what's already in the literature that I have published. And so that's unfortunate. Now let's consider the second example that I mentioned here, and that is Echoes of the Jurassic by Kevin Anderson. And I have to say from the outset that there are a couple of mentions of me in the book that make me very uncomfortable for several reasons. Number one, I have not been associated with the Creation Research Society for almost 4 years now. My laboratory was removed from there after I did the work, and because I felt that the work was going to be monopolized into a money-making venture, and this work is for the gospel of Jesus Christ. This work is to be used to preach the gospel to those who are open-minded and who are unaware of soft tissue and dinosaur bones. Nevertheless, I was acknowledged and thanked for a contribution to this book, Echoes of the Jurassic. I did not contribute anything to this book. I was also acknowledged for work on the iDino project. Of course, I brought the horn back to my laboratory and did all the work and published the paper. I added Kevin Anderson by professional courtesy as an author to the paper, but nothing more. And so I do not wish to be acknowledged, and I must disavow myself of this work for reasons that you're about to see. There's also a passage in the book where it states that during the excavation of the horn, and the horn being fractured into many pieces when we rolled it over and being wet and muddy, Kevin Anderson says, I turned to my colleague Mark Armitage. I think he meant I turned to my colleague Mark Armitage and questioned if there was any possibility that tissue could still be present. And I did not even consider the horn millions of years old. Yet the horn did have significant amounts of soft, pliable tissue, which is true. Everybody knows that now because I found it and I videotaped it and I showed the soft, stretchy tissue and have shown this multiple times to as many people who will watch. I'm not a colleague of Kevin Anderson. I'm disavowing myself from this work for the rather staggering errors that you're about to see that are in this book. And I just want everyone out there, particularly in the scientific community, that I had nothing to do with this book. And once again, I offered my professional advice as an expert on this project, but was ignored. Nevertheless, I regret also to have to point out to a couple of creationist PhDs who endorsed the book on the back of the cover. Here's one. This book may be short, but it comprehensively documents in an easy to read style all the discoveries of soft tissues and biomolecules in fossils, especially in dinosaur bones. It goes down further and it says, presenting the experimental and other evidence which confirms that they can only be thousands of years old. I highly recommend this book as a must-read for every Christian. Signed, Dr. Andrew Snelling. And Dr. Snelling, I'm sorry to say to you that you put your cart before your horse on this one. You should have been more careful. You could have frankly contacted me and asked me about this book and whether or not it had errors in it before you gave your acknowledgement to it. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you did that. In any event, also, here's another acknowledgement for the book. Dr. Anderson has written the best book to date on the dinosaur soft tissue discoveries. He concisely explains the science. You're going to see in a few minutes that he didn't get the science right. He explains the significance. No, he didn't really explain the significance, as I've mentioned before, and which I will mention again. And the feeble attempts by evolutionists to discount and distort the recent findings. This is, again, is a must-read for all Christians. So Dr. Tim Clary, I'm sorry to tell you that you probably should have held back until you were sure that this book was factual in its science. In any event, on page 23 of Echoes of the Jurassic, Kevin Anderson is describing the horn and what the horn probably was like in life. Now, we don't know. We don't have a clue, particularly with the outer part of the horn, what these horns were like in life. We do assume that they were surrounded by a keratin layer. And so he goes on to describe the anatomy of this horn. And he's also on the speaking circuit speaking about the anatomy of this horn.
Again, we weren't thinking of horn. If you know anything about anatomy, you recognize that most of the real soft, squishable tissue in a bone is toward the interior. Now, bones have different layers, and different bones are a little bit different, but especially like femurs and such, those have a lot of the calcium mineral and not much of the real soft tissue until you get inside of it. So you could make a kind of a real weak sort of argument that a bone can be preserved because that outer mineral protects the inside, but a horn sees the opposite. A horn has a protein keratin layer and then it's tissue mixed with mineral. And the actual bone of a horn is on the inside, not the outside.
And so he says that that there are layers of keratin and tissue wrapped around an inner bone horn core. The thin outer covering of tissue and blood vessels may enable Triceratops horn to serve as a thermal regulator. He's basically quoting the ideas of a researcher who did also collect Triceratops horn. It was much more degraded. It wasn't in the fine condition that that my horn was in. And you can see the little number 76 there, and so he's referencing someone's work. And if you look down at the bottom of the page where it says 76, he references WAP JW from 2010. Now, I couldn't find a WAP JW 2010 in the literature, but all one has to do is look at the paper that I wrote and published in Acta Histochemica in the reference section, and you can see that I reference HAP, H-A-P-P, J-W, from 2010, and that is the researcher who collected a very degraded Triceratops horn and postulated the idea that maybe it served as a thermoregulation, a heat exchange device, so that the Triceratops might give off excess heat. However, when you look at the structure of the horn that I collected, you see that there's no possibility that there would have been any soft tissue underneath the keratin and between the keratin and the outer bone. In fact, if you look at the horn in cross-section, you see that there is a massive amount of compact bone on the outside of the horn going all the way around, and as you travel to the interior part of the horn, you find trabecular bone, which is the part of bone that is absolutely loaded with soft tissue. And so Kevin Anderson is incorrect. The soft tissue is not at the outer part of the horn, it's at the inner part of the horn in the trabecular bone. And so this is discussed by Happ in his paper. He does postulate that maybe some of these excess blood vessels were used to give off heat, but he doesn't offer any conclusive evidence to that end. And so in Echoes of the Jurassic, Kevin Anderson calls the horn anatomically different from bone. Well, I just cannot say to you in strong enough terms how wrong that is. Horn is not anatomically different from bone. It is bone. Triceratops horn has a massive amount of compact bone around the outer part of it, and you can see this as you go across the cross section. And then it has a huge portion of trabecular bone, which is where all the blood vessels are running through the center of the horn. And so the horn is not anatomically different from bone. He continues, Triceratops horn contains bone material, but likely contains much more tissue and blood vessels than skeletal bone. No, again, not true. It is much the same as regular skeletal long bones in that it has compact bone around the outside and it has a large center of trabecular bone, which is full of soft tissue, soft blood vessels, and the like. He continues, this tissue is also more exposed than bone tissue, protected mostly by a thin outer bone layer, which is then covered by a very thin keratin layer. Once again, we don't know about the keratin layer. We don't know what was below the keratin layer, but these horns were built for combat. And at a minimum, they were used for sparring with other adult males or young males, which is what we observe in the animal kingdom with animals, males that have horns that spar against each other and may actually have to do combat with each other. If we are going to profess as a PhD, which is a research degree, about scientific things, then we should be correct. We do a disservice to science by being incorrect and sloppy in our work, not doing our work properly. So if we go back to the Acta Histochemica paper and we look in the discussion section, we see where I discussed the anatomy, typical anatomy of Triceratops horn. You see that I state that anatomically Triceratops horn offers a unique fossil structure with differentiated inner layers of varying thickness and porosity. I talk about the keratin sheath, which is probably there, but it has been altered and mineralized by the fossilization process. And then there's an outer bone layer of approximately 1 to 5 millimeter thickness. And then we have a Haversian compact bone area. This is compact bone, massive compact bone, that is embedded with vascular tissues, and I refer to HAP 2010 because this is what he discusses in his paper. And then inside of that outer bone layer is the horn core, made up of highly vascularized trabecular bone. And this trabecular bone is discussed by HAP. Every scientist who understands bone anatomy understands that trabecular bone has more open space to it, therefore there's more soft tissue in it. There are certainly lots of vascular, in other words blood vessels, and other soft tissues that inhabit this trabecular bone. I continue. The trabecular horn core extends almost the entire length of the horn, but terminates into a cornucinal sinus at the base of the horn where it joins the skull. And again, I reference HAP 2010. And if we go to the HAP paper and we look at his figures, these are CT scans, and then there's an illustration up top of the longitudinal section of the horn. You see the compact bone layer all around the outside of the horn. And then inside of that is the trabecular bone, which is where all the soft tissues are found. And then he draws several lines across that longitudinal section. And below, B, C, and D are the actual CT scans showing the huge, massive amounts of trabecular bone, which is where all the soft tissue is at the very center of the horn, which agrees not only with the paper that I wrote, but it also agrees with the horn that I have shown here with this massive compact bone around the outside of the horn. Now the compact bone is infiltrated with many vascular tissues, and they're just more protected by this massive compact bone. But inside of that, the trabecular bone, some people call it cancellous bone, is a portion of the bone which has more open space, and therefore it has much more soft tissue. So the discussion in the paper that I wrote, and to which I added Dr. Anderson's name as a professional courtesy, discusses this anatomy clearly. It's not difficult to understand, and HAP's own discussion and illustration show this to be true and matches not only my paper but the bone that I'm showing you here, which is a cross section of a Triceratops horn. Furthermore, in my paper I discuss that large strips of thin light brown soft material were recovered from the innermost interior sections of horn bone pieces. Pardon me. So in my paper I'm discussing where I found the soft tissues. And so for any researcher to put in a scientific publication that the soft tissues of a horn, because horn anatomy is different from most bones, the soft tissues are found at the outside of that structure, is incorrect, because the papers in the literature, including my paper, do not support that, and the actual physical evidence of the cross section of the horn that I'm showing here does not agree with that either. And so I have to set the science straight here. If scientific publications are going to be published by ICR or CRS, as I've shown in this video, that counter what is in the scientific literature and what is shown by the actual bone that I'm showing here, I have to stand up, set the science straight, set the record straight, and disavow myself of any cooperation with these publications. And so, if we go back now to Dr. Richard Lumsden's paper from the CRSQ, Volume 29, 1992, Error and Worse in the Scientific Literature, we should review a couple of the principles that he has set out here. Number one, and this goes to professors who are out professing science and they resent that they're forced to do research to make a living. Again, he's made the point that a salaried university professor cannot eschew the very job description that he is supposed to be fulfilling in his job. He states a salaried professor, tangible scholarship is neither an avocation nor an elective activity. It's part of the job. And so research has always been part of the job description, especially if you're a PhD, because the PhD is a research degree, not simply a teaching certificate. So this standard has been established in science. This standard of a PhD performing research, basic research, coming up with novel or new discoveries and reporting those discoveries in peer-reviewed research papers, journals, so that the scientific community can see the work that you're doing and comment on it, and take it under consideration when they go out then and do their research. To publish erroneous and mistaken things in a scientific publication is deleterious to science, because the folks that come along behind refer to this work and are starting off on the wrong foot because they're receiving bad information about the reality of whatever it is they're studying. And the second point that Dr. Lumsden makes, and remember he was dean of the graduate school at Tulane University, so he knows that the creationist journals are not up to par with standard research journals such as Acta Histochemica, not because they're not peer-reviewed, but because, as he says here, creationists as a group are characterized as talking or writing about science while doing very little of it themselves. And it's not uncommon to find creationist papers structured entirely of data elsewhere acquired. They're not collecting their own data on a subject. They're going and finding the work of others and plugging all that data into their paper and discussing it. And he says there might be some substance to the view that one who has no direct experience himself with the techniques, the study, the object system, the raw data acquisition and subsequent analysis is not in the best position to evaluate the data or draw conclusions from them. And I think that's the point that's been made here. The science has to be set straight. So here we have examples of scientific literature published by certain creationists and creationist organizations where references are clearly wrong, which could have been corrected simply by looking at the definitive paper on soft tissue in a triceratops horn that one of these scientists purportedly participated in. All that had to be done was to read that paper and compare what he was writing to what is already in print. And number two, to get the anatomy wrong doesn't even corroborate his own paper. So what's the takeaway here? Do yourself a favor. If you as a scientist plan or hope to write about the soft tissue in Triceratops horn, contact me. I'm easy to contact, and I would be happy to offer my professional and expertise on what was discovered in the Triceratops horn and what has been published to date. I'm probably not going to do any more corrections like this again. This is the third time I had to correct Dr. Fazal Rana on his book, Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth, because he got an entire, well, 2 chapters in his book completely wrong because he didn't understand my work. And now, of course, these 2 times that I've had to make corrections. So I'm not going to do this again. This hopefully will serve in perpetuity as an example for what should be done in the future if you do not want to embarrass yourself. In conclusion, let me reiterate the significance of the Triceratops horn soft tissue find. And that is that soft tissue, soft stretchy tissue, enormous amounts, were found in a Triceratops horn that was upended and stuck base up, point down into the soil in Montana, and was at the mercy of all the elements that I've described in this video, and yet produced beautiful soft fibrillar bone, as I published here on the cover of American Laboratory, that defies any description, any theoretical description of how this was preserved. And as I mentioned in the cover description for the picture in American Laboratory, these tissues were cryosectioned, thin sectioned on a cryostat, which is a frozen section machine with a steel knife. And so these were not ground down. These were soft tissues that could be cut on a cryostat to 10 micron thickness. So this is an astounding discovery, and if you wish to avoid any embarrassment in the future, feel free to contact me if you are going to write about my discovery in the Triceratops horn. I'm available, and I'm happy to give you expert advice on my discovery and help you to not embarrass yourself if you're going to publish a scientific treatise on this discovery. So my prayer is that many souls will be won to Christ as a result of the soft tissue and Triceratops horn that I have found and published on in several places. May God use this to His glory and to win people to Christ into the kingdom. Thank you for your support. Thank you for being patient and for watching this. And God bless you.